It began with a quiet shift and quickly became a storm. Marcus Lamb's death left a vacuum at the heart of Daystar television network, and the moment Joni Lamb stepped forward to fill that space, long-buried questions about money, family power and governance came rushing to the surface. If you want to follow every development in this story, hit subscribe and turn on the bell now. This is an unfolding crisis that will have consequences for donors, viewers, and the wider faith community. What began a succession after a founder's passing has become a larger story about how ministries manage power, how families handle conflict, and how public trust can be eroded when transparency is missing. Marcus's passing changed everything, not because loss is inherently destabilizing, but because it revealed how tightly woven the network's leadership was with one family's personal fortunes. Under Marcus's stewardship, Daystar grew into a global broadcaster with a devoted audience, millions of viewers and a funding system built on the generous contributions of people who believed in the ministry's mission. The network's identity had long been tied to the Lamb family itself, family faces on camera, family members in leadership roles, and a culture that blended spiritual messaging with the practical running of a media enterprise. That model can work when trust is high and the founder's presence provides a unifying authority. But it becomes fragile when that unifying presence is gone and the structures of accountability are not obvious to outsiders. When Joni assumed more visible leadership responsibilities, it was a natural continuation of family stewardship for many insiders. But to some supporters and critics alike, the succession raised immediate governance questions. Who had access to financial records? Who approved large expenditures? Were decision-making processes clearly separated from family loyalties? That curiosity quickly hardened into suspicion once allegations began to surface, suggesting that donor funds may have been used in ways donors never intended. Stories circulated, initially as murmurs, then as pointed reports, that ministry money had underwritten luxury homes, that high-value purchases were tucked away in opaque budget lines, and that assets like aircraft had been used in ways that raised eyebrows. Whether those allegations are ultimately substantiated in full, partially, or disproven, the charge itself struck a nerve. People give to ministries to serve others, not to sustain opulence. The issue at stake is not only whether particular purchases were legitimate, but whether the network's governance allowed even the perception of impropriety. Family-run organizations often blend affection and fiduciary responsibility, and when checks and balances are informal or internal, the risk of conflicts of interest grows. Donors expect clarity. They want to trace how gifts translate into impact. Where reporting is vague and oversight seems limited, questions are inevitable and, in this case, relentless. The heart of the controversy therefore became less about isolated items on a ledger and more about institutional design. How could such a widely watched ministry appear to lack independent financial oversight? Why did family ties seem to trump the need for external accountability? One figure who, according to reports, pushed that very question was Jonathan Lamb. Jonathan's public role in the dispute transformed the issue from a private family argument into a public governance fight. He reportedly advocated for clearer structures, stronger safeguards, and more independent oversight, steps designed to protect the ministry's long-term reputation and to ensure that gifts were stewarded properly. That push threatened established power lines and, depending on which account one reads, set off a cascade of family disputes that spilled into public view. The narrative presented to outsiders shifted between two versions: a son seeking reform out of concern for the organization's future, and a family in painful conflict where accusations and loyalty clashed in raw ways. The tension exposed a painful paradox. The very unity Daystar broadcast to viewers, the smiling family faces and shared stages, stood in stark contrast to the reports of secrecy and internal friction. The organization's public image of devotion, faith and harmony suddenly looked at odds with allegations of behind-the-scenes excess and internal protectionism. People who had long tuned in for morning worship and uplifting stories found themselves asking whether they had been seeing the whole picture. That cognitive dissonance amplified the emotional stakes. It felt like a betrayal not only of good governance norms but of spiritual promises made to trusting viewers and donors. Many supporters reacted to the unraveling with a mix of prayer, confusion, and skepticism. For some, the response was immediate and practical: pause donations, withhold support until independent answers were available, and ask partners and featured ministries to distance themselves until clarity returned. For others, especially those who had a deep personal connection to Daystar's broadcasts, the reaction was more grief than judgment, a sense of loss at seeing a beloved ministry's reputation stain under public scrutiny. Across social media, comment sections and private messages, longtime viewers wrestled with the reality that institutions they loved might harbor serious governance gaps. That erosion of trust was not limited to a single donor base, it spread across countries and communities where Daystar's programming had long been a spiritual touchpoint. Observers who follow the non-profit and ministry sectors saw a familiar pattern in these developments. Time and again, when fame, money and charismatic leadership cluster without strong external checks, the environment becomes ripe for misuse or for at least the perception of misuse. The ministry world has seen similar stories before: powerful personalities, opaque decision-making, and institutional cultures that resist external scrutiny until scandal forces them to change. Those historical parallels are not meant as automatic condemnation. Human organizations are complex, but they do underscore a simple governance truth: independent oversight is not optional. Without outside auditors, impartial board members, and transparent reporting, even well-intentioned ministries can find themselves vulnerable to missteps and to the erosion of public confidence. Part of the story that intensified public unease was the way transparency failures were described by critics. Vague reporting, carefully worded statements and assurances that promised cooperation with inquiries were not always accompanied by the kind of documentable, external evidence that would settle concerns. Donors and watchdogs asked for line-item clarity, access to audited financials, and clear explanations for purchases and compensation changes that appeared large in the months after Marcus's death. Where leaders relied primarily on spiritual language, calls to prayer, appeals to forgiveness, and statements about God's sovereignty, many listeners felt those words were not a substitute for the hard, mundane work of accountability. Prayer consoled, but it did not answer questions about asset ownership, flight logs, or the rationale for familial hiring practices. Grassroots responses highlighted another dissonance. On the one hand, congregations and viewers poured out prayerful concern, asking for healing, unity, and reconciliation. On the other, activists, donors, and some former insiders pressed for institutional reform, independent audits, conflict of interest policies, and the appointment of non-family board members. Those two impulses are not contradictory. Good pastoral care and good governance are complementary. But in this episode, the balance felt off. Prayer was abundant, reform was missing. That imbalance aggravated the perception that the institution was more interested in preserving image than in addressing structural problems that could protect the vulnerable and ensure donor trust. When allegations touch on the treatment of children or claim that internal loyalty impeded proper reporting to authorities, the ethical stakes get even higher. Reports that family members felt pressure to handle matters internally rather than call law enforcement raised immediate concerns among child safety advocates and legal observers. When institutions attempt to manage deeply personal and criminal matters behind closed doors, they risk re-traumatizing victims and undermining the very safeguards that are supposed to protect communities. Those concerns fueled the urgency of calls for independent investigation, not to recklessly vilify individuals, but to ensure that any wrongdoing is properly investigated and that victims are supported by the appropriate external authorities. What this entire episode makes painfully clear is that stewardship of a ministry's mission requires more than charisma and public goodwill. It requires structures that make accountability routine, regular, published audits, boards with a meaningful independent majority, conflict of interest policies that are enforced, and transparent reporting practices that make it easy for donors to follow the path of their gifts. Where family ties dominate decision-making, those safeguards must be especially robust to reassure an increasingly skeptical public that decisions are made in the light, not behind closed doors. The broader lesson extends beyond one family or one network. Faith communities depend on moral credibility. They must model the integrity they preach. Leaders who prioritize fame, wealth, or institutional preservation over service and humility risk not only their personal reputations but the spiritual well-being of those who trust them. When scandals emerge, they do not merely tarnish a brand, they damage relationships, undermine charitable giving, and leave communities wondering whether the values they were taught are reflected in the leaders who speak on their behalf. At the same time, responses must be measured and fair. Public accusations require careful handling, allegations should be investigated without rush to judgment, and individuals deserve due process. Yet due process and pastoral care are not substitutes for transparency. They must work together. A ministry that wants to rebuild trust will invite independent auditors, publish comprehensive financial statements, create clear whistleblower channels, and commit publicly to governance reforms that limit the dangerous concentration of power. For donors and viewers, this is a moment to be both compassionate and principled. Compassion asks us to pray for broken families, to seek reconciliation where possible, and to avoid the pleasure of scorning those who fall. Principle asks us to demand policies that protect the vulnerable, ensure the proper stewardship of resources, and prevent conflicts of interest from becoming institutional patterns. Donors can help by supporting organizations that publish audited reports and that demonstrate a commitment to good governance. Churches and networks can help by modeling transparency and by ensuring that leadership roles are not simply family inheritances but responsibilities subject to oversight. If Daystar and the Lamb family decide to turn this painful chapter into an opportunity for reform, the path is clear. Embrace independent oversight. Publish detailed financial reports and make them accessible to donors. Implement conflict of interest policies that are enforced rather than waved as slogans. Strengthen protections for whistleblowers and victims, ensuring that concerns are investigated by impartial bodies. And pair spiritual care with structural reform so that prayer and policy move together. If those steps are taken swiftly and sincerely, recovery is possible. Institutions have rebounded from scandal when leaders acknowledged missteps, invited external review, and made concrete changes. But if leaders retreat into defensive postures and rely solely on spiritual rhetoric to quiet criticism, trust will continue to erode and the ministry's work will suffer as a result. The larger call from this episode is simple and urgent. Faith communities must insist on accountability, honesty, and love as equal parts of their practice. Integrity is more than an ideal, it is the fuel that keeps ministry alive and meaningful. Without it, even the most beloved ministries can find their reputations, and their ability to serve, steadily eroded. For now, many remain in prayer, some are waiting for audits, others are watching for leadership changes, and donors are deciding whether to give. The story is not over. The decisions made in the coming weeks and months will determine whether this crisis becomes a turning point for necessary reform or another cautionary tale of what happens when family control, money, and influence run unchecked. For viewers and supporters who care about the soul of ministry, the demand is clear: insist on transparency, support independent oversight, and make sure that those who lead do so with humility, stewardship, and a commitment to the common good.